Welcome to the Middle-earth Philosopher, where I talk about people, ideas, and relationships within Middle-earth and try to examine them from a philosophical point of view of the people who lived in that world. When people generally think of the Noldor, they usually tend to view them through the lens of the First Age and how they came to Middle-earth in the first place, full of wrath and vengeful fury to avenge themselves on Morgoth for the death of their first High King and the reclamation of the stolen Silmaril jewels, and also how their wars and alliances were marred from the beginning by the Curse of Mandos, a mixed bag of alliances with the local peoples of Middle-earth, where some fought with them, others did not, and that there was infighting within the Noldor as well that, although non-violent, pretty much kept them separated. However, that was the First Age Noldor. The Noldor of the Second Age were an entirely different community with an entirely different outlook and how they acted on it as well. To truly understand this, we need to briefly go over the original template as laid out by the most famous and also most infamous Noldor himself, Feanor. During his recruitment/rant in Tirion, Feanor lays out a plan of expectations that the Noldor were supposed to take upon returning to Middle-earth, that being to take back the jewels that he stole and kill Morgoth, if possible, to establish new realms of Middle-earth of their own making and not hand-me-downs from the Valar, and to be independent of the Valar as well, and thus by that being proxy rulers of Middle-earth, as they were always meant to be in his view. These were the blueprints that the tribe was supposed to follow, and though various factions within the tribe prioritized or ignored certain elements of that blueprint, the general gist of it remained the same and intact right up until their final battle with Morgoth during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. That being coming from a position of power, strength, rage with an undercurrent of ego, prejudice, depending on what faction it was, and pride. In essence, you could say it was make the Noldor great again. Now, as we all know, this did not happen, and that the Noldor were generally a whipped and humbled people by the end of the First Age, even though it took 500 years of war and loss to do it, of course. But they did eventually get the memo that none of these elements were a good basis to live by and to live with others by as well. And though Morgoth was now gone and his armies now scattered or dead, there wasn't much left in the way of a path towards repentance to get back in the graces of the other peoples of Middle-earth, with the only real option left to them being to return to Valinor at the command of the Valar. Now, having said all that, we get into this new generation of the Noldor. And at the start of the Second Age, while it does appear that a large number of them did actually return west, there was still a good amount that chose to remain. And I don't think this was done out of ego like their forefathers who came to Middle-earth in the first place. Rather, and it's ironic that I referenced this, but I think it's Sauron who says it best when he says that the Noldor still had a great love of Middle-earth and that was the main reason they chose to remain. That they still wanted to enrich the world just as they had done in Valinor, since they were the go-to people in Valinor if you wanted to build something to look great. In other words, like all elves, there is a spiritual bond between them and the physical world that is unique to their species. So, it's only natural that they would not want to isolate themselves from it like the Vanyar and Teleri had, effectively killing off that part of their own identity, or at the very least, permanently muting it. However, I believe there are other elements at play as well. Most of the original leaders are dead, with the exception of Galadriel. Gil-galad, who is now the High King of the Noldor, still survives, and Maglor technically did survive, but he apparently disappeared at the end of the First Age, never seen again by anybody. The survivors were left with processing and acting on the bloody lessons that they had learned. To accompany these changes, new leaders were also brought into the fold, Elrond and Celebrimbor being the biggest one of them. All of these people in the Noldor hierarchy had lived through the dark era of the First Age. They knew what it was about, what happened, why it happened, and what it had led to, so there was a full understanding that things needed to change. That being said though, I also think that these Noldor also had a large amount of guilt about what their fathers had done. Now, while the Noldor were not directly responsible for the ruin of Beleriand, their wars were the catalyst of it, and many people suffered and died as a result of it, and the ultimate manifestation of this being the sinking of the entire northwestern portion of Middle-earth. Now, as a side note, I don't know how the fuck that happens, how you sink an entire continent, and it's never been fully explained to me, so if you have any ideas on that, please comment below, but there you are. Now, while the Noldor do establish two new realms of Middle-earth, that being London and Eregion, it is not founded in the same treachery, prejudice, and distrust that haunted their Beleriand territories. Gil-galad seems to have formed a solid relationship with the humans that lived in Eriador, and even in Eregion, they established a good and long-lasting and healthy friendship with the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Dwarves, mind you, that included survivors from the fallen realms of the First Age as well. So they knew what the First Age Noldor was about, and yet they still supported this friendship, so that's pretty cool. Thus, how the Noldor were acting in this new age with themselves and with the people around them is a stark contrast to how they were acting when they first arrived in Middle-earth in the first place. However, they were still Noldor. Therefore, they still had that drive and urge to make and build things. Now, this is where the Second Age Noldor usually tend to do come up in conversation, that because of this drive, they still had a quote-unquote ego, and thus made them deceivable by a disguised Sauron. However, I think this assessment is not really a fair one. With all the mistakes that the Noldor have done, building shit was not one of them. They were literally created to do that. That was their purpose in life. It's more so their nature than any past inclination of violence or rebellion. Moreover, as I mentioned before, the leaders had learned from the mistakes of their fathers, and so were much more discerning when it came to suggestions from outsiders trying to stoke those egos. And, as everyone knows, this is a large reason why Sauron was rejected in London and at the Falas. But in Eregion, somehow the Noldor was still received. Celebrimbor was still received. Now, to be fair to these group of Noldor, there's more than meets the eye to this as well. The book The Downfall of Númenor does imply that it took Sauron a while to actually accomplish this deception. It wasn't just something that happened overnight. But to truly understand Eregion's motives, I think it's important to use Sauron's exact words when trying to convince them to join his cause. Understanding Sauron's words and reading in between the lines from the ears and perspective of the Noldor who are listening to him. And I will read a portion of it here. My apologies if this sounds a bit rough. Reading quotes is not my strongest thing, so please bear with me. Alas, for the weakness of the great, for a mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands as blissful as their own? But wherefore in should Middle-earth remain ever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eressëa, no, even Valinor? And since you have not returned, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth as do I. Is it not then our task to labor together for its enrichment, and raise all the elven kindreds that wander untaught to the height and power and knowledge of those who live beyond the sea? Now, I'm sure there were a couple parts that actually kind of messed up there, and I may have paraphrased, but you get the general idea of what he's saying. And it's important for this particular case to reference exactly what Sauron is saying here to understand Eregion's perspective. Essentially, Sauron is hitting on the fact that the army of the West picked up and left Middle-earth in a mess after they had fucked it up during the Battle of Morgoth, and that of all people, the Noldor should know better than this. This sounds very similar to Feanor's arguments way back in Tirion. And even though I don't think Celebrimbor was even around during that time, he still would have felt that same conviction. Also too, Sauron is hinting at that these elves have a responsibility to make Middle-earth a better place, something the Valar themselves had fiercely debated way back before the elves even came to Valinor, and was actually originally their charge. but that because Middle-earth was their actual responsibility for what happened, these Noldor had a responsibility to now make the Second Age greater than the First Age and not repeat the same mistakes that their fathers did when they arrived, passing down their knowledge to their elven kindred and not hoarding it or keeping it to themselves like most of the Noldor did during the First Age in Beleriand. And it wasn't just this guilt trip that Sauron was laying on them. Sauron's also appearing in the guise of an emissary of Valinor, kind of a false Gandalf, if you will. So, if you're a Noldor hearing this emissary saying to you, hey, we got a responsibility to the land and these people because we were the ones who helped fuck this up in the first place, and I want your help to do it, what are you going to say? The nuance here is that Sauron is hitting the Noldor at all levels here. He's hitting on their guilt, he's hitting on their nature, he's hitting on their desire to make recompense for what happened. And while the downfall of Numenor also states that Celebrimbor took up this offer in part to rival his grandpa Feanor, it was still a vastly different sentiment from Feanor's original ambition. At worst, you could argue a potential corruption when Sauron, from the back seat, manipulates Celebrimbor's political party to legitimately take over Eregion so they can create the rings, and that Galadriel and Celeborn, who both thought Sauron was sus, chose to leave. But it's also important to note as well, they chose to leave. They were not driven out. And right here is your worldview of all the Noldor during the Second Age. Make Middle-earth a better place and don't repeat the mistakes of the past. This all ties into the latter portion of the Second Age when the wars start happening, and Numenor starts to assert its dominance, and the Noldor start their fading back to the west. Now, I assert that the philosophy of the Noldor during this period changes because they begin to see that any influence on their part to repair Middle-earth, it has become a pointless endeavor, or at the very least is becoming more and more a pointless endeavor, and that they no longer have the physical and spiritual strength to achieve that. Sauron's wars do more than just kill elves. They use scorched earth tactics, and this scars, I believe, their very souls because of their bond to that world. And it made them much more sensitive, especially given their past during the First Age. Also, the reforming of Middle-earth by the removal of that spiritual component, i.e. Valinor, from that dimension, and yes, I'm calling it dimension because that's the best way it makes sense to me, that also affected the Noldor as well. On a side note, I think this doesn't affect the Sylvan Elves as much because they were never officially indoctrinated into that part of their nature, and they also had no direct exposure to the Valar of Valinor. They had no prior conflicts with them or Morgoth like the Noldor did as well. And I think this is why Legolas refers to the Noldor as a quote-unquote strange people, being that the Sylvan Elves' only real contact with them is pretty much through Galadriel and any they may have fought with during the wars. This is largely because the Sylvan Elves chose to keep to themselves when the Noldor arrived at the beginning of Second Age in the eastern part of Middle-earth. Now, they weren't openly hostile to them, as in, if you come near us, we're going to kill you, but at the same time, they were very much isolationists, almost as bad as the Vanyar and Teleri way back in the west. So, it makes sense that you can almost kind of consider them distant relations, I guess you can say. And this is also what helps make the Noldor of the Second Age more myth and legend than any other elven tribe east of Middle-earth. That being said though, the Noldor of the Second Age were not their forefathers. They tried to do right that their forefathers should have done by all the communities that they came in contact with and make right as much as possible what had been done wrong, not for the sake of dominion, but for love of the world. And I think that worldview deserves more appreciation than just being the immortal bad boys of Tolkien's universe.